He erased her name from the record in a single afternoon, not in anger, not in haste. With the calm, methodical precision of a man who had confused control with care for so long that the two had become indistinguishable to him, 47 partners across 9 cities knew Kang Seojin as the architect of the most insulated private logistics network in the region. They did not know Lim Hae-won. They had never been permitted to, and on the morning she stopped existing inside his world, it took him until the 41st unreturned call to understand that this time was different. The woman who had kept him anchored had simply stepped out of reach. She left one sentence on a single folded sheet of paper inside his desk drawer, tucked beneath a copy of a contract she had written, and he had signed. Without reading, 7 words. A man who counts everything had never once counted her. That sentence would take him the better part of a year to answer correctly. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was gone. And he had no idea what she had already built in this space. His blindness had created. The refrain comes from a woman who worked in silence for a decade before she allowed herself one act of visibility. It goes like this. The only ledger that matters is the one no one else can read. She had been keeping it since the year their son turned 1. By the time Kang Seojin found it, the entries ran to 411 pages, and the last page was not addressed to him. This is how a man who built an empire by never being surprised discovered that the most consequential architecture in his life had been constructed right beside him in plain sight by the one person he had decided required no attention at all. Kang Seojin was 31 years old when the network that would define the next decade of his life began to take its shape. He did not build it for nothing. He built it from a kind of cold, focused reading of what other people in his world were doing badly. The private logistics sector in the eastern corridor of the region was fragmented. 40-year-old families running contracts on handshakes, intermediaries collecting fees for relationships they no longer maintained, warehousing operations managed by men who had never audited their own systems. Seojin saw the gaps before anyone named them, gaps he was not the most powerful figure in the room at any given meeting in those years. He was the most prepared. He had inherited a mid-tier distribution firm from an uncle who died without a successor at the age of 58, leaving behind 12 employees, a modest fleet of vehicles, and a reputation for reliable silence. The silence was the inheritance that mattered. In his world, discretion was worth more than margin. He understood this at 29, when he took over the firm. He understood it more completely by 31, when he began to see how discretion could become leverage, how reliability, carefully packaged and strategically extended, could constitute a kind of institutional currency that no rival could easily counterfeit. He was 32 when he met Lim Hae-won. She was not part of his world in any formal sense. She was the younger sister of a mid-level attorney who occasionally handled contract review for one of Seojin's northern distribution partners. The attorney was competent, unremarkable, the kind of man whose professional identity was entirely contained by his professional competence. Holman attended a dinner at her brother's office as a courtesy, because he had asked her to, because a senior partner was retiring and the occasion felt incomplete without family present. She sat at the far end of the table and said very little. Seojin noticed her because she was the only person in the room listening more than she was performing. He did not approach her that evening. He asked her brother a question about her 2 weeks later, framed as casual professional interest. It was not casual. He had spent 2 weeks thinking about a woman he had observed for approximately 90 minutes, and what he remembered most was not her face, but the particular quality of her stillness. She had watched an argument develop between 2 senior partners at the dinner with an expression of calm, precise reading. No performance, no positioning. Just attention. He learned 3 things from her brother. She had recently completed a graduate program in organizational systems. She had spent 2 years doing documentation work for a regional compliance consultancy. She was methodical in ways that made people around her faintly uncomfortable because her methods tended to surface things those people had preferred to leave unsurfaced. He called her himself a week after that. She answered after 4 rings. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. By the end of it, she had asked him 2 questions he had not been prepared for, and he had not answered either of them to his own satisfaction. He called her again 3 days later to finish answering the first one. This is how it began. Not with spectacle, with the sensation of being understood at a frequency he had not previously encountered. Haewon paid attention in a way that was not flattering. It was accurate. She did not predecide what mattered about him. She watched what he actually did and formed her views from that, and the distinction, in his world of performance and strategy, felt nearly physical in its difference. They were together for 4 years before their son was born. In those 4 years, Seojin's network expanded from 12 employees in a single regional contract to a quiet, interlocking structure of 43 operational nodes, 7 long-term partnership agreements, and a reputation so carefully maintained that it had become, in itself, a kind of moat. Haewon was not listed anywhere in this structure. She had no formal title, no nameplate, no official capacity. What she had was access. She had his trust, and she had his documents, and she had a systematic mind that could look at a complex arrangement of relationships and obligations and identify, within a reading of 2 hours, exactly where the structure was weaker than it appeared. She found 3 such vulnerabilities in his first major partnership agreement. She told him about them on a Tuesday evening over a meal she had cooked. The same voice she used to discuss everything, without elevation, without ceremony. He incorporated her corrections, restructured the relevant clauses, and did not tell the partner that the revisions had come from outside the official review. He thanked her. He meant it. He moved on. This was, in retrospect, the first entry in the ledger she had not yet begun to keep. Their son, Junho, was born when Haewon was 31 and Seojin was 37. The birth was uncomplicated in every clinical sense. What complicated? It was the timing. Seojin was in the middle of a negotiation with a consortium of 4 northern partners who were restructuring their combined eastern contracts, and the restructuring required him to be physically present at a series of meetings across 3 different cities over a 10-day window that began 4 days after Junho arrived. He went. He told himself he had to. He told her he would make it right. She said nothing, except that she understood. She did understand. That was the difference between them. She understood, and she stored the understanding without releasing it, the way a precise instrument stores a measurement without immediately displaying it. She was alone with a 4-day-old infant when he boarded the flight north. She remained effectively alone in the ways that mattered for the next 10 years. This is not to say he was absent. He was present in all the ways that could be arranged. The apartment was in a building with a concierge and a 24-hour service desk. There was a household account with a ceiling that never required her to think about cost. There was, 2 years after Junho's birth, a full-time domestic assistant. There were dinners, vacations, formal occasions at which Haewon appeared at his side, and which in the aftermath he would remember as evidence of a life being shared. She had attended, she had been present, he had arranged everything. What he had not done was listen, not once. In the 10 years that followed Junho's birth, did Seojin ask Haewon what she was thinking about something other than his business, his partnerships, his structural problems? Not once did he ask what she wanted. He asked what she thought about what he was doing. She told him with the same accurate attention she had always brought, and he heard the content of her words and missed the silence underneath them, the silence that was not peace, but accumulation. He had, across those 10 years, made exactly two significant decisions regarding their life together that were not motivated in some primary way by the needs of the network. One was choosing the neighborhood. One was choosing Junho's school. Both were decisions he made after consulting 3 business associates whose children attended the same school. Iwan had researched 17 schools. He had not asked to see her research. He had not named her in the partnership documentation, though she had reviewed or restructured 31 of the 47 active agreements. He had not introduced her to the 12 most significant partners as anything other than a social companion. He had, on one documented occasion at a dinner attended by 2 senior figures in the network's northern tier, deflected a direct question about her professional background, with a comment that reduced her to the role of the mother of his son, delivered with a kind of fond, managing brevity that he thought was protective. She had been standing beside him. She had heard every word. She had smiled. She had said nothing. 3 days later, she began the ledger. The ledger was not initially a strategy. It was a record. She was, before anything else, a woman who documented things accurately, and she had reached a point where the gap between what she was and what she was permitted to be named had become something she needed to measure. She began entering things not in anger, with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Dates, events, decisions, the exact words used in particular exchanges, corrections she had contributed, and the agreements those corrections had protected, vulnerabilities she had identified before they became failures, the names of partners who did not know her name. She kept it in a system she had built herself, on a private server she maintained at her own cost, accessible through a verification architecture that would have been, to any competent person reviewing it, recognizably the work of someone who had spent years watching how private institutional systems could be penetrated. She had also, beginning in the 4th year of the ledger, been watching something else. Something she had not gone looking for. Something that had revealed itself to her in the course of her ordinary, quiet, unremarked attention to the structures around her. Seo-jin's most trusted lieutenant was a man named Do Chang-soo. Chang-soo had joined the network 8 years earlier. He was 44 now, lean in manner and precise in dress, the kind of man whose reliability was so consistently performed that it had long ago stopped requiring performance. He arrived early. He stayed late. He returned calls within the hour. He remembered names, preferences, dates. He was, in Seo-jin's estimation, the most valuable operational figure in the network after Seo-jin himself. What he was doing in parallel for a period of at least 14 months before Haewon first noticed, and at least 22 months before she had assembled enough documentation to be certain, was quietly positioning a rival consortium to absorb 3 of the network's most critical Eastern contracts at the moment of maximum structural vulnerability. He was not doing this for money, though money was involved. He was doing it because he had spent 8 years watching Seo-jin make decisions from a position of absolute authority and had concluded that the network's success was less dependent on Seo-jin than Seo-jin understood, and that a transition of key relationships to a parallel structure executed at the right moment would require less institutional disruption than anyone anticipated, because the relationships were, in many cases, maintained not by Seo-jin himself, but by the systems Haewon had built and that Chang-soo had been carefully learning to read. He had understood, as Seo-jin never had, that Haewon's invisible architecture was the actual connective tissue of the network. He had decided to learn it well enough to lift it without her. This was the entry that changed the ledger from a record into something else. Haewon had no obligation to protect a network that had refused to name her. She understood this. She sat with it for 11 days after she was certain about Chang-soo, and what she arrived at was not obligation, but a different motivation entirely. Junho was 9 years old. The network's collapse, if Chang-soo executed his plan, would not injure Seo-jin irrecoverably. He was resourceful and connected and would rebuild. But the men in the northern tier who had extended their loyalty across years on the basis of a trust architecture they did not know was being undermined would lose real institutional value. 3 of them had brought younger partners into agreements on Seojin's network's credibility. Those younger partners had made decisions in good faith. She was not willing to let them be casualties of a betrayal they had no way of seeing. She protected the innocents first, then she built the response architecture. It took her 14 months, working in the hours after Junho was asleep, to assemble the documentation into a form that was simultaneously complete, legally coherent, and structured as a trail rather than a delivery. She did not want to hand Seojin an answer. She had spent 10 years providing him with answers and watching him receive them without registering their source. She wanted him to follow. She wanted him to move through the evidence with the same methodical attention she had spent a decade offering him, and she wanted the movement itself to be the teaching, because she had learned by then that a man who received things was not changed by receiving them. A man who discovered things, who worked for them, who earned the understanding, might be. She prepared 6 custodians. 6 people, each in a different location, each trusted by Haewon for independent reasons, each holding one sealed piece of the documentation and one instruction for where to send whoever arrived asking. She told each custodian the same thing. If a man named Kang Seojin comes to you and asks, give him what I left you, assess him honestly. If he is not ready to hear it, tell him he is not ready and send him back. They were not performing mystery. They were applying the same standard she had always applied. Attention, readiness, the demonstrated willingness to actually see. She chose the locations deliberately, not dramatically. Practically, she chose people whose professional credibility meant that anything they said would be taken seriously by Seojin, because she understood that in his world, the weight of information was partly a function of who delivered it. She arranged for Junho to stay with her brother's family, explaining that she needed 2 months for a personal project. Her brother asked once if she was all right. She said yes. She was, for the first time in several years, entirely herself. Then she left. She left on a Tuesday morning. She left the 7-word note in his drawer. She turned her phone to a number he did not have. And she went to a rented apartment in a coastal city, 412 kilometers from the building where she had spent a decade being undocumented. And she slept for the first 3 days, for longer than she had slept in years. The note said, the ledger was for when you were ready. Seojin found it at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, which meant it had been there since the previous day, and he had not been in his own desk drawer for more than 24 hours. This registered, he read the sentence twice, he called her number, nothing. He called it 9 more times over the next 4 hours. He told himself she needed space. He told himself she would call. He reviewed the sentence again at 7 p.m. and felt, for the first time, the particular quality of its calibration. It was not a wound line. It was not an accusation. It was a direction. She had not left him a goodbye. She had left him a premise. He spent the night at his desk trying to find what she meant by ledger, and by morning he had located the private server address embedded in a document she had marked with a single asterisk in a file folder he had never opened, a folder labeled, with her characteristic straightforwardness, for when you look. The folder had been created 6 years ago. He sat with this for a long time. The server required verification steps he had never known existed. It took him most of the next day, with the help of the network's data architect, to establish that the verification architecture was so precisely built that the only way through it was the way she had designed, which was to say it could not be forced. It had to be entered correctly. He found the entry protocol in a secondary file she had indexed inside the server's own welcome directory, which was itself navigable only once the first verification was complete. He worked through it methodically, which was not his natural mode. His natural mode was delegation and resolution. This required him to do the thing himself, step by step, in the sequence she had ordered, and the sequence itself was a demonstration of how her systems worked, of the patience and layering that went into architecture built to last rather than to impress. When he finally entered the server, he found it organized into 3 sections. The first was labeled Record, the second was labeled Evidence, the third was labeled First Stop. He opened the third first. Inside was a name, an address, in a city 230 kilometers to the northwest, and a time. The time was 3 days from now, at 11 in the morning. A note underneath read, "You will need to have read the record before you arrive, not all of it. The first 40 pages he will know if you haven't." He spent that night and most of the following 2 days reading the record. He had expected it to be an indictment. It was not. It was exactly what she had called it. A record, dates, facts, corrections she had offered. The exact structural outcomes those corrections had produced. The partners she had assessed, and the assessments that had proved accurate. The vulnerabilities she had identified in 29 of the 47 current agreements, with notes on which ones had since been addressed by her through him without attribution, and which remained live. It was written in the same voice in which she had always spoken to him, not elevated, not wounded, accurate. It read like the work of someone who had decided that the most honest thing she could do was maintain a precise account of what actually was, rather than what was performed or claimed or credited. By the end of the 40th page, something had shifted in him that he could not yet name. He drove to the northwestern city on the 3rd morning, arriving 17 minutes early, and sat in his vehicle outside the address until 11, because he was not willing to be the kind of person who arrived late to a thing she had measured time into. The address was a ceramic studio on the 3rd floor of a narrow building near the waterfront. The man waiting for him was a retired institutional auditor named Pak Sunja, who had the particular bearing of someone whose professional identity had been entirely constructed around the accurate naming of things. He was 61 years old. He had worked with Haewon 8 years earlier on a compliance review for a company she had briefly consulted for, before Seojin had discouraged her from taking formal client work on the grounds that it complicated the appearance of the network structure. Pak Sung-jae looked at him for a long moment after he entered. He said, "She told me you would come either resentful or frightened. You look like neither," Seojin said. "What do I look like?" Pak said, "Overdue." The word sat in the room. Pak handed him a sealed envelope and spent 40 minutes telling him, in the methodical cadence of an auditor, about a specific contract restructuring from 7 years prior, one that had been heading toward a catastrophic misalignment between the network's liability exposure and its coverage terms. He described the restructuring that had occurred and its outcome. He named, precisely, the source of the corrections that had prevented the misalignment from becoming a failure. He named the woman who had made those corrections. He noted that the woman's name appeared nowhere in the contract's revision history. He said, "A structure only holds as long as the people who understand it remain willing to maintain it." Seojin said nothing. Pak said, "She did not leave this for me to explain to you. She left it for you to have confirmed by someone who had no stake in your being correct about it." The sealed envelope contained an address in a second city, 300 kilometers east, and a name and a note. The note said, "Read pages 41 through 90 before you go." He drove east. He read the pages in a hotel room the night before the appointment. Pages 41 through 90 documented his professional treatment of her across 10 years with an accuracy that was worse, for its absolute absence of self-pity, than any accusation would have been. It was not a complaint. It was a measurement. She had not written it to make him feel guilty. She had written it because she was a person who documented things accurately. And this was accurate. He slept badly. He arrived on time. The second custodian was a woman named Cho Miri, who ran an independent legal advisory practice from a converted residential building on the eastern waterfront. She was 56, with the particular economy of gesture that comes from decades of managing other people's urgency without absorbing it. She had worked with Hyewon intermittently for 5 years, advising on the structural legality of several of the network's agreements, always at Hyewon's direct request, always billing Hyewon privately, because Hyewon had never been in a position to route the cost through official channels. Cho Mire said, "She paid for my time out of her personal account. Every consultation for 5 years. She never asked to be reimbursed. Seojin said she never told me." Cho Mire said she knew you would have offered to pay and then noted the amount as a network expense, and that would have been the end of it. He understood what she meant. He sat with it. Cho Mire handed him the second sealed envelope. She also handed him a separate document, a summary of 3 legal vulnerabilities she had identified in network agreements. At Hyewon's request, vulnerabilities she had been retained to quietly resolve through contract amendment without Seojin's knowledge. All 3 had been resolved. All 3, had they remained unresolved, would have created exposure that could have been exploited by a hostile party at exactly the kind of juncture a hostile party would choose. He looked at the dates on the amendments. 2 of the 3 had been finalized within the past 18 months. During the same period that Hyewon had been building her evidence file on Chang-soo, she had been closing the gaps, quietly, while she was also building the trail, while she was also raising Junho alone, while she was also being unnamed. He did not say anything for a while. Cho Mire waited. She was not uncomfortable with silence. He said, "Did she seem all right?" "When she was here," Cho Mire said, "she seemed like someone who had made a decision and was executing it without regret." He drove to the next city. There were 4 more custodians. Each of them held a piece of what she had built, and each of them assessed him with the same calm neutrality, the same willingness to tell him plainly what she had done and what he had failed to do, and in each case the plain telling was worse and better than any version of the story he had constructed for himself in the car between meetings. The 5th custodian was a data architect in a middle city who had built the verification system for the private server on Hyewon's specification. He told Seojin that the architecture had been designed to fail silently under any forced entry attempt, not to alert but simply to close, and that the only documentation of the server's existence was the single asterisk in the file she had left for him. He also told him something else. He said that 4 weeks earlier, Hyewon had accessed the evidence section of the server and added a final file. He did not know what was in it. She had not told him. He handed Seojin the 5th envelope. Seojin opened the envelope in the car. Inside was a single instruction: access the evidence section. Now, read the file marked final entry before you go to the 6th custodian. The 6th custodian will need to know you have read it. He sat in the car and opened his phone and navigated to the server through the verification sequence he had memorized by now, and he opened the evidence section and he read the final entry. It was not the evidence on Chang-soo. That was already in the evidence section. 411 pages of documentation, so thorough and legally precise that it constituted, as far as he could assess, a complete institutional case for removal, civil liability, and notification of every affected partner. He had known about it since the 2nd custodian. It had been sitting in him for 2 days. The specific cold weight of understanding that his most trusted operational figure had been dismantling the network from inside for nearly 2 years, and that his most overlooked partner had been the only person who had noticed. The final entry was newer. It had been written 3 weeks ago. It said, "Chang-soo knows I have been building this file. I do not know how he found out. I believe he found out approximately 2 weeks ago. The reason I believe this is that his behavior changed in a specific and legible way, and I am a person who notices behavioral patterns in systems I have observed for a long time. He does not know where the documentation is stored. He does not know the scope, but he knows enough to know that if it surfaces, his operational window closes. He will not run. Running is not his mode. His mode is control. He will move inward. He will attempt to position himself to manage the exposure from inside the network by making himself indispensable to the restructuring process before anyone knows there is a restructuring process. He has done this before, in a smaller context 11 years ago before you knew him. The documentation on that context is in the evidence section under Secondary File 3. If he moves inward successfully before this file surfaces, he will be significantly more difficult to remove. The window to move first is not unlimited. She had written the timing note at the bottom. She had estimated, based on behavioral observation and the pattern of decisions he had begun making in the past 2 weeks, that Chang-Su's lateral move would begin within 60 days of the date she had written this. The date was 3 weeks ago, which meant the window was approximately 5 weeks from now, possibly less. He called the 6th custodian from the car and said he had read the final entry. The 6th custodian said, "Then you already know what the 6th envelope contains." He said, "Tell me, anyway." The 6th custodian was a man named Yun Tai-hwan, a former regulatory compliance officer who had spent 20 years inside the institutional framework that governed the private logistics sector, and who knew, with the specific procedural knowledge of an insider, exactly which reporting mechanisms existed to surface a betrayal of the kind Chang-Su had been executing, and exactly which of those mechanisms, once activated, could not be quietly buried by any party, including Seojin. They spoke for 2 hours. Seojin took notes for the first time in the conversation sequence. Yoon was precise and unhurried and spoke about the regulatory architecture with the same quality of attention Ha-won had always brought to everything, and Seojin recognized the frequency and felt it acutely. She had chosen these people deliberately, not for drama, for accuracy. Yun said at the end, "She told me one thing specifically to tell you." Seojin said, "Tell me." Yun said the trail was not designed to shame you. It was designed to prepare you. There is a difference. Seojin sat with that for a long time after Yoon left. The difference was this: shame was a conclusion. Preparation was a beginning. He had not built the trail because she wanted him to arrive at the end of it broken. She had built it because she wanted him to arrive at the end of it capable, and because she understood that the only way to make him capable was to make him walk through the evidence himself, in sequence, with attention, in the way she had been asking him, without words, to walk through his own life for 10 years. He found her on a Thursday morning in the coastal apartment, 412 kilometers from everything he had built. She answered the door in the kind of unhurried way that told him she had known he was coming and had decided to let him knock anyway. She was wearing her own clothes, the kind she wore when no occasion required anything of her, and she looked, he thought, as though she had slept well and eaten well, and had been, for the past weeks, entirely herself. She said, "You read it." He said all of it. She said all 411 pages. He said 412. She added the final entry after she wrote the last page count. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, the recognition of accuracy. She made tea. They sat at a small table by a window that looked out toward water. The light outside was flat and gray and even. He said, "Chang-Su." She said, "I know." He said, "The window is 5 weeks." She said, "I estimated conservatively, I would say 4. He said, "I need the full evidence file." She said, "You have had access to it since the second day you were reading it between custodians." He said, "I need to know if it's enough to take to Yun's mechanism without additional support." She said, "It is." Yun will tell you the same. The file was built to that standard specifically. He said, "You built it to a legal evidentiary standard." She said, I built it to the standard that would protect the partners who were not responsible for any of this. That standard happened to also be legally sufficient. He was quiet. She said, Junho is well. He has been asking when he can see you. He said, I want to talk about Junho and about everything else. But first, I want to say something. She waited. He said, I did not count you. I counted everything else, and I did not count you. And every correct thing in the past 10 years had your attention in it. And I credited the structures and the relationships and the outcomes, and I did not credit the person who made them hold. I know the sentence I need to say, and I am not going to pretend that saying it once is sufficient, but I want to say it once now and then, demonstrate it over time, so that you can decide whether the demonstration is real. She said, I know what you're going to say. He said, I know you do. Say it anyway. He said, you were the only ledger that mattered, and I never once read it. The room was very quiet. She said, I know. Then she said the trail was also designed to give me an answer either way. If you followed it, I would know something had changed. If you did not follow it, I would know something had not, and I would have made different arrangements. He said, what arrangements? She said, the same evidence file routed through Yun's mechanism by Cho Myre on a 90-day trigger I set before I left. If you had not reached the 6th custodian within 90 days, the file would have been submitted automatically. The network would have been protected. The partners would have been protected. You would have had the information. He said, without having earned the understanding. She said, yes. He said, you gave me a chance to earn it. She said, I gave myself a chance to find out if you could. They worked for the next 4 days at the table, by the window, and in the evenings on the phone with Yun Taiwan and Chomira, and the architecture they built together was not elegant, but it was precise, and it was thorough, which is to say it was built in her mode, not his, and he adjusted to her mode without remark, because he was finally paying attention. The regulatory submission went through Yun's mechanism on a Friday morning. It was accompanied by a supporting legal brief prepared by Cho Myre, a data integrity certification from the server architect, and a formal statement from Pak Sung-jae. The mechanism, once activated, was required by institutional rule to notify all affected parties within 5 business days and to initiate a supervised review within 15. There was no provision for quiet burial. Haewon had known this when she chose Yun Chang-soo's response was not what Seojin had predicted. He did not run, as she had assessed correctly. He moved inward, exactly as she had written in the final entry, calling 3 of the senior northern partners within 48 hours of what he must have detected as a change in the procedural environment, offering himself as a restructuring coordinator in language that was helpful and controlled, and to anyone who had not read the evidence file. Entirely plausible. 2 of the 3 partners called Seojun before returning Chang-soo's call. They had worked with him long enough to know that a call from his most senior operational figure out of sequence without prior coordination was a data point worth checking. He told them what he could tell them, which at that point was that a regulatory review was underway, that they would receive formal notification within 5 business days, and that he was asking them, as a matter of the trust they had built across years, to hold before making any structural decisions until they had seen the full picture. He made no promises he could not keep. He did not perform certainty he did not have. The 3rd partner had already agreed to a preliminary call with Chang-soo. That partner called Seojin 2 hours later to say that the call had felt wrong in ways he could not yet name. Seojin said, "You have good instincts." The partner said, "I have been listening to your network for a long time. Something in it changed." Seojin said, "Something in it is being corrected." The formal notification reached the partners in 4 business days. The supervised review found the evidence files sufficient on the first examination. The mechanism moved with the procedural speed of an institution that had been designed to move quickly when the evidence met the standard, and the evidence met it completely because the person who had built it had understood the standard before she began. Tangsu was located 11 days later in an apartment he had rented 6 months prior under a secondary name, which was among the things in the evidence file that had initially surprised Seojin and had not, on reflection, surprised him at all. He was sitting in the apartment with 4 months of documents and a plan that had nowhere left to go. The institutional mechanism had already reached the partners he would have needed, and those partners had already made their decisions, and the decisions were not in his direction. He had built his leverage on his proximity to Seojin, and Seojin had rebuilt his proximity to something else, something Chang-soo had spent 8 years studying without ever fully understanding, because to understand it, you would have had to pay a different kind of attention. No violence occurred, there was no occasion for it. What had been taken was institutional, and the institutional response was sufficient. What remained was procedural and legal, and slow, and entirely appropriate in its slowness. The partner who had felt the wrongness of Chang-soo's call said something to Seojin at the first formal gathering after the review concluded, a quiet dinner. 14 partners, the kind that had no occasion other than the restoration of a thing almost lost. He said, the network held because of work I did not know had been done. Seojin said, you did not know because I did not name it. The partner said, then name it now. So he did. He stood in a room of 14 partners, most of whom had never known her name in any formal context, and he named her. He did not prepare the speech. He did not perform it. He said plainly what she had built and what she had protected and what she had found and what she had done, and he said plainly that the attribution had been his failure, and that the failure had been present for a long time, and that it was not a failure of intention, but of attention. He said, the only ledger that matters is the one I was not reading. And he said her name with the specificity of someone who had spent weeks learning what it meant to say it correctly. There was no applause. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms become quiet. When a thing is named that has been known but unspoken for a long time, several of the partners nodded. The one who had asked him to name it did not nod. He simply looked at Seojin with the expression of a man recalibrating a long-held assessment. Months later, in a spring that arrived earlier than anyone expected, Seojin and Haewon sat again at the small table by the window in the coastal apartment. He had made the drive every weekend for 4 months. She had not moved back to the city. She was not ready. She had told him this plainly, and he had heard it as plainly as it was offered, which was one of the things she was watching for in the demonstration period she had required of him. The required period was 18 months of demonstrated change, not declared change. Demonstrated. She had specified 3 observable behaviors. She had written them down. She had given him the list not as a test, but as a measure, because she was a person who believed that a measure, offered honestly, was more respectful than an expectation implied and never named. She said, Junho wants to stay through the summer. He said, then he should stay through the summer. She said, he also wants you here through the summer. He said, I know. She said, that would require you to run the network from a coastal city for 2 months. He said, I have been thinking about that. It is not a structural impossibility. It is a preference. Preference, she said. A what? He said, it was something I read in the record, page 67. You wrote that I frequently confused structural impossibility with preference and cited 4 instances where I had presented a preference as a constraint. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you read page 67. He said, I read all 412 pages, twice, the second time I took notes. She looked at him for a moment in the particular way she had always looked at things when she was deciding whether what she was seeing was what was actually there, or whether she was seeing what she hoped was there. She was not a woman who confused hope with accuracy. She had never been. This was one of the things about her that had, in the beginning, made him feel understood. This was one of the things he had, in the middle years, stopped being grateful for, because it had required something of him that was easier not to give. She said, "The ledger was for when you were ready." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not saying you are ready." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I am saying there is a second ledger. I began it the week you reached the first custodian. It records different things." He said, "What things?" She said, "Attention. Whether what I say is heard, whether what I build is named, whether I am counted." He said, "How many pages?" She said, 31. "So far," he said, "tell me what a good entry looks like." She said, "You asking that question, that is a good entry." Outside the window, the water was gray and still, and the light came down, flat and even and unhurried, the way light comes when a season is turning toward something new and has not yet decided how warm it is willing to become. Junho was in the next room doing something with paper and paint that required concentration. The sounds he made were the sounds of a child entirely occupied by the present moment, which is its own kind of precision, its own way of paying attention to exactly what is there. The only ledger that matters is the one you are willing to read. He had not been willing for a long time. The willingness was recent and fragile and required daily maintenance, which is not a condition of weakness, but the ordinary condition of anything built to last rather than to impress. She knew this. She had always known it. She had kept the record until he was ready to know it too. It was, as beginnings go, quiet, unsentimental, honest. The kind that does not announce itself but simply continues, one entry at a time, into whatever comes next.